Japan, English, Japanese. If you wish to use this interpretation function, please kindly find the interpretation icon in the bottom menu and choose the language. Those of you who would like to listen into the English translation, please click on the English. And those of you who would like to listen to Japanese, please click Japanese. And in the latter half of the program, there will be question and answer session. If you wish to ask or make comment to the panelists, please send it from the Q&A function so the moderators can read and pick up. However, due to the limitation of time, not all the questions or comments that may be selected. We kindly ask the question or comment to be stated as clear and simple as possible, and also make clear to whom you are addressing your questions or comments to. Without further ado, I would like to hand over the microphone to the moderators, Professor Kamiya, Distinguished Research Fellow of JFIR and Professor of National Defense Academy of Japan, and Mr. Schoff, Senior Fellow of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So let me start. And today, I would like to welcome all of you and thank you very much for joining the symposium, Managing China, Adopting U.S. Japan Coordination Amid Political Transition, co-hosted by Japan Forum on International Relations and Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, not only from Japan and the United States. At the time of application, more than 800 have registered from all over the world, including China, as the co-host. I am indeed very delighted to see such a large attendance. My name is Kamiya. I am the professor at the National Defense Academy of Japan, although I am also director and distinguished research fellow at the JFIR. I will be serving as a co-moderator together with my good friend, the Jim Schoff, who is also a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We will divide up our role. The Japanese panelists will speak in Japanese and the American panelists will speak in English. So I will moderate when there will be a Japanese speaking Japanese, and Jim will moderate when there will be a speaker who will be speaking in English. Let me briefly explain about the background of the symposium. We are holding the symposium from the spring of 2017 with the two think tanks working together in the Japan-U.S. Joint Research Project entitled China Risk and China Opportunity. I serve as a leader, and Jim is the leader on the American side. And as to the aim of this joint the project is China, which is today the second largest power in the world next to the United States, as represented in the behavior in South China Sea as well as East China Sea. China is putting on challenge to the international order, which has been foundation for the past few decades for the world's peace and prosperity, the liberal and the rule-based international order. For Japan and the United States, in a sense, it is a serious challenge to our security. And in a sense, it is an adversary, an enemy-like the nature. I may be overstating, but at the same time, many countries of the world are at the same time deeply interdependent economically. So many countries of the world, including our two countries, have concern over the risk of increasing assertiveness of the China using force in order to pursue natural interest, but we also want to be more cooperative with the China. Many developing countries see China as a country who provides opportunity for them to become prosperous and lead a convenient life. So it is highly complicated, but nonetheless, we need to deal successfully with China in order to suppress the selfish behavior of China and try to induce them to be more cooperative. It is indispensable for the United States, which is the largest power in the world, and Japan, which is the third largest economy in the world, Japan and the United States have strong alliance between us. And we have, by and large, common understanding as to the perception of China, as well as how to deal with China, who is posing various challenges, and as to the future prospects of how China may become in the going forward. But we have perception, the gap, and the possibility between the two countries because of the difference in the geopolitical environment, as well as the difference in how we have related with China. Having recognized such a possibility, we need to coordinate and align our policies vis-a-vis the China. So in our research project of China risk and China opportunity, we have that awareness in our studies. Back in 2017, when we started the project, there was not that many projects which have looked at both sides of the situation, the risk and opportunity of China. There were no joint research between our two countries. Japan, we are adjacent to China, and we have a Senkaku Islands issue with China. From the early times, we have emphasized the potential risk of China. And in contrast to that, in the United States or in the European countries, they tended to place emphasis on opportunity. But as things have developed, in order to properly face China, we need to see both the risk as well as opportunity for China. And that has been the consensus for both practitioners as well as many researchers in the world. 2021 would be an year of big challenge for the coordination of Japan and the United States vis-a-vis our policies against China. And as we have seen, new administrations born in our two countries, we have also seen the spread of COVID-19. And China has become even more assertive. There is the so-called the vaccine diplomacy going on. We have Professor Kanehara, Professor Takahara from Japan. We also have Dr. Amy Sealight, as well as Dr. Patricia Kim, those who are the authorities who are well-versed on China issues. I am so delighted that we are able to see such illustrious people participate, and also seeing so many people in the audience. This is good for our project. I have talked at length, so may I switch over to Jim now.
Thank you very much, Professor Kamiya. It's been great to work with you on this project and to work with the Japan Forum on International Relations several years now. I almost feel like we're at the I House here, beginning our big public event with the hall filled with everyone. And that's reminding me of a better time when we're all able to be together. But it's wonderful to be with you all here in this way. So thank you for joining us. I am Jim Schoaf. I run the Japan program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and particularly interested in this project we've been doing for several years. There are multiple papers and policy briefs and memos that have been American, Japanese, sometimes together in teams. We have a couple of new papers coming out, now one by Patricia Kim and one by Cooper. So we encourage you to check our website for information there. I'm going to introduce our panelists just a little bit more in some detail, and then I think Professor Kamiya is going to open up with the first question and we'll get started. Clearly, the big issue here is we have a new administration in the United States. The Biden administration has three of its four main goals really rely heavily on working together with allies and in the international community, rebuilding the economy, defeating the pandemic, and addressing climate change are three major objectives of the Biden administration. Allies like Japan are a key part of the strategy, but how China fits into all of this. It's a high priority for both governments, and how we coordinate and address our policy challenges is the main theme for today. So very pleased to have with us our guests from Japan first. We have Nobukatsu Kanehara. He's a professor at Doshisha University and a distinguished research fellow at the Japan Forum on International Relations. Previously, of course, he served as Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary to Prime Minister Abe and Deputy Secretary General of the National Security Secretariat, following a long career in the Foreign Service. It's great to have him with us. We also have Professor Akio Takahara, a professor of contemporary Chinese politics at the University of Tokyo, and serves concurrently as director of the Japan International Cooperation Agency Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development, and also a distinguished fellow at JFIR, Kokusai Forum. Dr. Amy Seawright is a non-resident senior associate for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia and Senior Advisor for Asia at USAID. And Dr. Patricia Kim, an expert on Chinese foreign policy and U.S.-China relations, currently a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a visiting scholar at Columbia University, and a senior policy analyst on China at the U.S. Institute of Peace. So with all those introductions behind us, let's get started. Professor Kami, I think you will be asking the first question.
All right. Now then, as I said earlier on, regarding Japanese panelists, I will ask questions. First is a question to Professor Kanehara. Well, this is the question that Jim was dying to ask. It's a big picture question because Kanehara-san served in very high levels of the Japanese government and at the embassy in Japan. He was the Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary. He was serving as a diplomat in the embassy in Japan, generally speaking. He knows very well about the Japanese diplomatic policy. So immediately after the birth of U.S. administration, especially the government, the parties changed. So what should be the approach of the Japanese government to a new U.S. administration? The priorities of the diplomatic policies, the contents of the policies, how are we going to coordinate with the U.S. counterparts? Suga administration, together with the U.S. security team, there may be some China policy related items. What are the priority items for Suga administration? It's a big question. I will be more than glad if you can respond to this question. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I no longer work for the government. I can't represent the government, but I can talk from my educated guess. I will speak about 3 points. First of all, liberal international order is something that we stick to, rules-based international community, as Europeans say. Why is it so important? The second point, what is the problem and issue with China? And the third one, it is regarding the Biden administration. The Western solidarity, it has to be realized as soon as possible, especially as the leader of the Western camp, we want the U.S. to rise again. What kind of policy measures are we going to share between Japan and the United States? First of all, liberal international community, importance thereof. After the Industrial Revolution, just 10 or so countries went ahead and they have created the international order, and it is called G7 now, plus several more countries. There were many wrongdoings, 2 wars, major wars, power struggle happened, and the societal gap was not resolved in some countries. And then Hitler came, and the National Socialism came about, and communism came about. Before the war, after the war, it's the same thing. the Asian countries and African countries did not come into this group, and they became the victim, and they were sacrificed because of the racial tensions and other problems. But now, at long last, the human dignity is equal, and we are born to become happy. The government is a tool for the happiness of the people, not vice versa. So this is the idea taken for granted, regardless of the color of the skin or religion or faith. It's all the same for mankind. So liberal international order is something that we want to create. This is something that we must protect, especially in Asia, Asian people, just like us. They don't have the same history. They were colonized. They don't have the same history. So they want to develop very rapidly, and some of them went into the dictatorship. From the latter part of the 80s, democratization went ahead. They came closer to the market-based economy. We have to engage them. We have to engage them so that the Western liberalism and democracy have to expand over the Asian continent. This is what is meant by free and open Indo-Pacific. What is the problem with China? During the Kissinger era, Japan helped China to come to the Western camp. We must not return China to a Mao Zedong era. So they have to democratize. So we helped a lot. We helped a lot for them to become WTO member. But after the Lehman crisis, China became overconfident, and they're saying that they're different. They are going to be number one, and they will remain as number one, not changing anything. One thing I regret is the patriotism and the nation-building myth of communism are replacing the other principles. So I think there is a dark sort of spirit of wanting to have revenge of the history. The Xi Jinping grew up during the days of Red Guard until 1976. There were no university classes. So maybe they don't understand the liberal society. So they think that their way is all right, great success. So they will go with power, with force. So it's a naked power struggle, 19th century-like power struggle is the viewpoint that China has. There are two problems. One is the maritime expansionism. The big navy would go around the world. But from 1982, they are beginning to say that they are going to. So we thought that from Bokai to Yellow Sea, and all seas are going to be included, and they want to have a gigantic naval power. One is the market distorting measures. They became the member of the liberal economy, but there are so many state-run enterprises, a lot of subsidy, and there is an integration and fusion of military and private sector. And industry power equals with the military might. That's what they think. So there is an all-out national effort to build economy. So it's an alien kind of force at work. Free and open market economy is being invaded by this alien force. Now, third point, Biden administration. What do you want from Biden administration? China occupies 16% of world GDP, US 24%, EU with UK about 20%. Japan is only 7% of the global GDP, 3-point-some% of for India. Korea is about half. So if you add those countries, it's over 50%. China will catch up with China in 2030. But they will not be able to catch up with U.S., Japan, and Europe. As Mr. Pompeo says, we have to have unity. But President Trump for him, it was very difficult to unite the Western camp. So I hope President Biden will unite the Western camp so that China can be engaged. There are three things it has to do. One is a strategy, especially the national power, that China is overwhelmingly large. And if U.S. Dissociates from China, all countries will succumb to China. So U.S. has to unite the Western camp, and then there can be power balance. This is something that I want U.S. to do. The second one is market economy. China has a very strong pressure of market distortion. So we should say, don't do that. That is wrong. This is bad. So we will have to say, wrong is wrong. During the Abe administration, we formed TPP-11 without U.S. Japan, EU has formed economic partnership agreement with Europe. So, of course, I hope that U.S. will come back to TPP. The last point is the liberalistic system. It has to be viable. It has to engage people. And we have to show that the liberalism is something that can really work for the people. Lastly, I would like to talk about something specific, climate change. We have to cooperate with China. CO2 is emitted the largest from China. Another point is Taiwan. Taiwan, well, U.S. is too far away. There is no alliance. So China can be dead serious about Taiwan. In 2 weeks, they can get Taiwan. And once Taiwan is gotten, we can never get it back. So the ambiguity is the best, some people say, but whether you keep it ambiguous or not, China will come. So if we are not careful, we will not be able to prevent wars. So we are right beside Taiwan. We can't just avoid facing the question. That is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jen. Can I turn over to Jim now?
Sure. Thank you, Kanehata-san. You set us off on our agenda very effectively, and we will get to Taiwan a little later in the program because that's a critical issue. But Amy, just as a start, how about from the Biden side, as you see things? What's your impression so far about how the Biden administration is organizing itself for foreign policy making vis-a-vis East Asia, vis-a-vis China? And how might Biden's approach differ from Trump's? Kanehata-san already alluded to some of what Japan is looking for from Biden. What should Biden administration be doing, in your opinion?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for having me in this very interesting discussion. Early days, but I think there's some important things we can point to. I think, first of all, it's important to point to what I think are going to be some continuities with the Trump administration, as well as what are likely to be some very significant differences when it comes to East Asia and China. But first, the continuities, I think we are going to continue to see a much tougher stance towards China, first of all. Secondly, I think we're going to continue to see a real attempt to see security and economics and technology as intertwined in a strategy that involves getting tough on China. So those dynamics are, now seen as inextricably intertwined, both in the region and in our. And third, I think the geopolitical constructs that have emerged over the past decade, the Indo-Pacific geo framework and the Quad. The Biden team has already indicated that those are here to stay. And so I don't see any major rebranding on those fronts. But big differences, at least this is the way I see some big differences emerging. And first and foremost, and this is the overarching difference, I think, we will see a much more strategic framework emerge. And what I mean by this is the Trump administration put in place some important policies towards China. And, the free and open Indo-Pacific was arguably a strategy, and certainly some important pieces of a strategy were there. But there were a lot of, it was very scattershot. There were a lot of contradictory elements. There was a lot of missing pieces, such as, just no coherent trade policy, or if there was a trade policy, it was one that was very incoherent or contradictory to other parts of a strategy. So in other words, an America First strategy, America First set of policies was really undermining to an attempt to build a balancing coalition against China in many respects. And even, John Bolton has written this, and many others, even advocates of or members of the Trump administration have, really mourned the fact that Trump did not have much of a strategy. He himself often contradicted his own team's national security strategy. So I think the Biden team is going to try to march out, and I certainly hope, I think they should, and I hope they will march out with a much more, an attempt to make a much more coherent strategy. In other words, work on really trying to integrate all aspects of American power, all tools of American statecraft, from the military to the diplomatic to the economic, to the normative, the development, democracy, human rights aspects of American statecraft into a real strategy, even perhaps a grand strategy that will really take on the long-term challenge we face with competition against China. Grand strategies are always incredibly hard, and whether that can be realized is a big question. Whether it's ever realized is a question. But I think the attempt will likely be there, and I think we'll get a lot more in the way of a coherent strategy, a smart strategy, than what we've seen in the past, 2 administrations, or even more than that. So I think, and that a corollary of that is we're going to see a much more streamlined, a much more rational policymaking process. We're going to see much more professionalized policymakers and a more streamlined, normalized policymaking process where really, real options are carefully thought through and vetted and put on the table and presented to the president and his team, and hopefully they'll make tough choices, which one has to make to come up with a real strategy, and they'll march forward. Now, what are the substantive components of that? Well, it's clear that they're going to be working very hard to build a strategy that is going to have a big component that's going to be working with allies and partners in a very seriously coordinated effort. So more than just the typical, in the past, the United States has always talked about allies and partners and has worked with them. But I think we are now in an era of a much more deeply coordinated effort. I think the era of unilateral American leadership is over. Even if we could go back to the old days of full-blown American leadership, I don't think we really can. But I think, now that we have such resilient partners and allies like Japan and Australia and others in Europe and elsewhere, I think, and India, I think that we need to work with them in a much more in much more solidarity kind of way, and really work with them to rather than imposing American devised solutions to regional problems, we need to really work with them to develop their own ideas and a real burden sharing in a strategic kind of way for how to deal with regional and global problems with them. So a much more, Ash Carter, former defense secretary, used to talk about a network of security partnerships. And I think, not just on the security front, but I think more broadly, we're really going to be looked at networked leadership on these issues. And the Biden team is well placed to do this, although it's going to take a lot of effort to restore the kinds of the frayed ties that we have with these allies and partnerships, but the hard work is going to be done on that front. Another component is going to have to be, as Hannah Harrison alluded to, engaging China. And I think the important part here, because 2 big priorities in the Biden administration is going to be climate change and dealing with the pandemic. And you have to engage China on those issues, and the Biden team will. But I think it's important that they will signal, and I think we've already heard John Kerry, the climate change envoy, very carefully articulated that engaging China on climate change, for example, does not mean that that's going to be at the expense of directly confronting China on other issues like the South China Sea and the Uyghurs and other things. So I think the mistake that was sometimes made in the Obama administration was there was not careful signaling on that front, and many people saw that as trading off cooperation in one area for confronting China in other areas, I think that's a terrible choice to think one has to make. The Chinese never respond to cooperation in one area they never trade off in that way. China will cooperate when it is in its interest to cooperate, and it will not cooperate when it is not. Those trades never work. China will try to convince partners that's a choice partners have to make. It's a false choice. And I think the Biden administration understands that. Ensure allies and partners that cooperation and engagement with China in certain key areas will not come at the expense of confronting China in other core areas. And then focus on democracy. And that's also been made clear, although how that is going to really play out, I think we have yet to see. But there's going to be a real attempt to work with democracies to build a coalition to deal with some big problems, that including predatory practices of China and other countries, perhaps cybersecurity, malign influence activities, and other kinds of things, as well as democracy promotion. But how the agenda is going to play in the region, and in particular in Southeast Asia and South Asia, where you don't have many full-blown democracies to work with, I think is an open question. And so I think how that is flushed out is going to be very important. And then finally, in terms of what I think they should be focused on is both how to combine a democracy agenda with dealing with countries in the region that are important partners but are not democracies, or are democratic backsliders, but still important partners for us. And then how to deal with a trade agenda, an economic agenda. The United States has to get back into a trade game at a time when the region is marching out with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and other initiatives. But at home, we're still very not ready to engage in real trade liberalization and globalization. So that's a big challenge for the Biden team.
Thanks, Amy. And we'll get a chance to get back to Southeast Asia a little bit later in the discussion. Kamiya Sensei, you want to go next?
Yes. Now, next question is addressed to Takahara Sensei. Especially, there is a transition from Trump to Biden. It's a major transition. During this transition period, what is going to be the political and diplomatic position of China? How do you assess China's political and diplomatic position during this transition? What are China's priorities vis-a-vis the U.S. and Japan? Have you noticed any difference so far in how Beijing has approached the relations with the Suga and Biden administrations, which has just begun, compared to Abe and Trump era? Is it becoming different? Is it different? Thank you very much for your question. Thank you very much for inviting me, having me on this symposium, important symposium. On the Chinese side, Trump's administration was unpredictable, and they were at the throes of the whim of Trump administration. It is usually said more common sense, more predictable Biden administration was created, which was welcomed by China. So Biden administration would be easier to handle. I think that is the general thinking in China, also viewed from China. In the case of Trump administration, they would be going after bones even at the expense of meat. So that was the Chinese policy. As a result, China was very much damaged because of trade policy and so forth of the United States. So before the Trump administration, Obama administration, So new power relationship, that was what the China was asking the Obama administration. So reminiscent of China's position to Obama administration, more moderate position is being taken by China. But of course, to Biden administration, China is not optimistic. China does not draw any rosy picture from Biden administration. So from the Chinese administration, so comparing the power of the states, they know that they can't still catch up with the US. There are still differences. So they want to stabilize the Sino-US relationship. It's very important. Economically, it's very important. Politically, it's very important. Diplomatically, it is very important. So they want to see stability in the US-Sino relationship. I think that is the basic position. That is unchanged from the past. And of course, I will add, Sino-US relationship worsens, and that became a new normal for China. Chinese people are now gradually accustomed to the new normal situation in a way. But basically, the intelligentsia, the eminent people in China are saying that stability of the US-Sino relationship is the foundation for all relationship for China. So this is unchanged. This basic principle is unchanged. Therefore, viewed from the Chinese side, strategic competition with the United States. You can't help but having this strategic competition, but at the same time, they want to have cooperation. So the creation of a Biden administration can be a springboard for having a new kind of cooperation. I think that is strongly desired by Xi Jinping administration. When the US-Sino relationship was bad, they approached Japan. It's the traditional, it's the common approach China would take always. So Suga administration has changed the Abe administration, but it doesn't change the mechanism. So East China Sea activities will be invigorated, and they will probably increase the pressure over Japan. So their basic posture is unchanged as such. So viewed from Japan, the neighbor wants to have a good relationship with us. That's fine. So in words, they say so, but by force, they want to have my own land under their control. That is not something that we will be convinced. So competition and cooperation should run in parallel. That is this situation continues for Japan, and I think the situation continues for the United States as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then Jim Shelf, please.
Great. No, that's so we've kind of sized up the Japan view and position, the United States, the Biden administration, and China. So Patty, I wanted to ask you, we've heard a little bit about what Biden wants to do and what it should do and the ideal or the goal, but how do you assess the political environment here within the United States toward China policy, because it has to operate within that environment? And how might this political environment or feeling about China influence the way the Biden administration approaches China policy and China policy coordination with Japan? Maybe you can remind us of some of the measures that came out of Congress and the Trump administration recently that the Biden administration has inherited as a starting point for its China policy. And I'll just let everyone know that some of these issues are all addressed in Patty's most recent paper up on our website for the project. So Patty, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I'd like to thank the Japan Forum on International Relations, the Global Forum of Japan, and Carnegie Endowment for inviting me on this panel today. And it's been a privilege to be a part of the China Risk and Opportunity Project and to be a part of the conversation today. With regards to the political environment in the United States towards China, I think it's quite clear that there's been a significant decline in US perceptions of China in the last few years. And this decline began first among American political elites, members of the US media and the business community, who all became increasingly disenchanted with Beijing's growing authoritarian turn at home and its aggressive behavior, especially since President Xi Jinping's rise to power in 2012. And what's interesting is that for a while, there was a gap between the US public and US elites, with average American citizens not necessarily viewing China's growing power as an area of concern. But this changed from around 2018, when the US-China trade war began to heat up and popular views of China began to steadily decline here in the US. And last year, of course, following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, they plummeted to all-time lows. And in fact, if you look at recent polling by the Pew Research Center and other survey organizations, nearly 3/4 of American citizens now view China in a negative light, and more people identify China as a rival rather than a potential partner. And of course, a lot of this negativity, again, has been driven by the COVID-19 pandemic and perceptions that China's initial mishandling of the outbreak is to be blamed, at least partially, for the damage that was wreaked by the pandemic. But having said that, I think the US-China relationship will be strained in the post-COVID era as well. And this is because many of the sources of conflict between the two countries are rooted in long-standing structural and historical factors. For example, I think American leaders have been long frustrated by the lack of reciprocity in access to China's market and to its media sector. But unless there's a significant change in China's political or economic system, which I don't think is very likely in the near term, I don't see these kinds of structurally rooted bilateral conflicts getting resolved anytime soon. Similarly, I don't see Beijing reversing course in the near term on its aggressive actions in the South and East China Seas, in the Taiwan Strait, within its own borders in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, given many of these issues are considered core interests on which Beijing believes it should not compromise. And if you parse the rhetoric that is coming out of Beijing in recent weeks, there seems to be an indication that China will not be reversing course anytime soon. So in response to the economic, political, and security challenges posed by China, we've seen a series of US executive and congressional actions during the Trump administration, like, for instance, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act that sanctioned Chinese officials responsible for the crackdown in Hong Kong, or the Taiwan Travel Act that called for more high-level exchanges between Taipei and Washington. There were also many executive orders, including ones that curbed Chinese tech companies' access to the US market and to US technology based on national security concerns. And I think despite the change in administrations in Washington, many of these previous policies are likely to stay in place. Now, of course, as Amy discussed in her remarks, the Biden administration's China policy will differ strategically and especially in tone from the previous administration, with an emphasis on placing US values front and center and working closely with allies and partners. And the Biden administration has also clearly stated that it will compete with China when necessary and cooperate with it in areas of common interest, like climate change and non-proliferation. Having said that, I don't see any sort of diplomatic reset, some kind of full diplomatic reset between Beijing and Washington coming, or I don't see a sweeping reversal of the many hardline China policies that have been enacted by the US Congress and executive branch in recent years. And I think we can unpack a bit more about what this means for US allies as we move further into our discussion today. But I'll wrap up for the moment by pointing out that I think US-China competition is likely to extend into the foreseeable future. And therefore, there will be a strong desire and expectation here in the United States for US allies to work together with Washington to counter the troubling aspects of China's behavior.
Thanks, Patty. Yeah, absolutely. We just saw yesterday an example of this with the expected confirmation of the Secretary of Commerce, but members of the Senate suggesting that they will put a hold on that confirmation until the candidate vows to uphold the Huawei entity list designation, for example. So you already have examples of Congress trying to legislate or use their position to push and force China policy on this front. Kamiya Sensei, back to you.
All right, I have finished the first round. So we have completed the first round of questions already. Many important points have been raised by the four panelists. So we would like to go further, one more round, question and answers. So we'll go to more specific questions this time. Well, time is limited, so please respond rather briefly to Professor Kanehara. During the Trump administration, as we look back, during that time, the executive branch as well as the Congress, legislative branch, acted together, and they came up rather aggressively, broadly to China. For example, the tariffs, export control restrictions, limit Huawei's ability to do business with American companies, or by semiconductors derived from U.S. technology, visa limitations for Chinese journalists and scientists, among many others. So many things were done. So my question, do you have an opinion about which measures during the Trump administration that Biden, I don't know whether aggressive is a right adjective, tough measures, which ones Biden should keep or which ones Biden should possibly relax? If you have any opinion, I would like to hear your opinion, please. We are believing in free trade. So limiting that can only come from the security reasons. So if there is a security concern, of course you have to do it. Now, platform, it's a network, it's a data flow world. It's a communication. That's China is not coming in there, but in other areas, China is coming in, and it is connected to cyber intelligence and sabotage. So 5G or marine cable, TikTok, WeChat, those are the words. Semiconductor is a bit different. Military technology, state of the art, mobility, fintech, they are all connected in this world. Taiwan, Korea, China are making semiconductors, but the designing is done by US and Japan and UK and Poland. So in this world, if they are all absorbed up, that's not good for us. We can't help that they come along, but we shouldn't let them have it. US is making China make it, but we will not make them make it. And the TSMC and China relations were severed. So I think this situation will not change. Tariff is raised, and because of security reasons, well, that is difficult to say. Climate change and other questions would come. So you have to consider in a general package. In the securities world, the IPO is excluded. Chinese IPO is excluded from New York. For IPO, China can only list in Hong Kong or Shanghai. So supply chain discussion has not matured. Making things in China, and from China, rare earth, we buy a lot from China. So on the side of supply chain, we have to work on better resilience. We have to work more. Did I answer your question?
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Schroff?
Thank you. So jumping now back to the Southeast Asia, South China Sea, Amy, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. We have now a new law or directive in China authorizing Coast Guard ships to use force in certain situations. We've seen already early in the Biden administration some tension around Taiwan and in the South China Sea in terms of naval access, freedom of navigation. But more broadly, how do you see, China policy for the allies playing out in South China Sea, Southeast Asia? How should we be approaching this area in 2021?
Well, the South China Sea has become the litmus test for American resolve in the face of Chinese assertiveness and maritime territorial aggression in the region. So I think it is really important at the outset for the Biden administration to show some resolve to deter Chinese aggression and to deter specific moves by China to militarize their outposts or artificial islands or seize additional territory, and to reassure allies and friends in the region, including some of the claimants of the maritime features of the U.S. commitment to maintain a presence in the region and support for the principles of freedom of navigation and peaceful resolution of disputes, et cetera. The other side of reassurance is, and there has to be a balance that the U.S. has to maintain. The other side of reassurance is to reassure the region that the United States is not going to become too provocative and escalate tensions in the region. This is a narrative that China pushes. And the states in the region have made very clear, even most of the claimant states have made clear that they do not want to be forced to choose between the United States and China. And so the United States has to walk that line between showing up and not seeming to be too provocative. So one thing that can be done, and I would certainly advocate the Biden administration to do, is to maintain a regular schedule of freedom of navigation operations, as the Trump administration has been doing. They've done 10 freedom of navigation operations in 2020 and 2019. And I think that has set a very regularized tempo of operational presence in the region. I think it's very important to maintain this very just steady tempo that doesn't sort of dial up or dial down. It just is a very consistent message that underscores the United States' commitment to freedom of navigation as a core principle that the United States has always stood for. And other presence activities in the region, the United States has been doing more and more exercises with allies like Japan and other partners. So doing more and more multilateral exercises, doing more exercises in the South China Sea. So continuing to do that, I think is helpful. But continuing to do things that were done starting in the Obama administration to help partners in the region develop their maritime capabilities, both their navies and their Coast Guard, so they are better able to police their territorial waters and deter Chinese aggression. Stepping those kinds of activities up would be helpful. But all of these are still sort of piecemeal. I mean, all of these still need to be, are insufficient in and of themselves. There still needs to be a real strategy, which gets back to my initial point that you really need to have a real broad strategy that is not just a military strategy or security strategy. So a South China Sea strategy has to be both a full-blown South China Sea strategy that is done in coordination with allies and partners, and is embedded in a larger sort of China strategy and is not isolated to just military options to deal with Chinese actions. And then finally, I would say for, as part of this reassurance strategy to the region, if this is a no-brainer, but the United States and Japan and other countries have to continue to show support for ASEAN and to show up to all the ASEAN meetings, even though ASEAN has been eroded significantly in its ability to get much done and to show much unity. But I think it's important as a signal, if nothing else, to show up and show that kind of support for the institutional infrastructure in the region and hopefully find ways to build a little bit of institutional strength.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, a tough issue for sure to put it all in that big picture of a strategy. But I think we will see, in many ways, the Trump administration their Asia policy was a derivative of their China policy, and I think you'll see an attempt at least to turn it around and have more of an Asia policy that helps and supports a China policy.
Very important. Yeah.
Kamiya Sensei, back to you.
Thank you. Just one word to add. Using the prerogative of the moderator, may I speak? The Asian policy of Trump administration was a little better than their European strategy, but viewed from Southeast Asian countries, they wanted the US to look at them more. Fortunately, Prime Minister Abe hung in there, and Trump looked at Japan, and India was also seen. But Southeast Asia was forgotten. Now, one more important question, Taiwan. Takahara Sensei, I have a question about Taiwan. Now, Professor Takahara, recently in the United States or in Japan or even in China, vis-a-vis Taiwan, what is the trend regarding their policies vis-a-vis Taiwan, especially Japan? It's talking about the trends. Is there anything which has to be adjusted or coordinated? Are certain adjustments advisable? Taiwan issue is very difficult, I know, but please, I want to hear your expert opinion. The recent trend is something that I can talk about. Trump administration, up until very recently, as you know, took the policy of coming closer to China, one after another, closer to Taiwan. They passed laws, and for the bureaucrats, they were sent to Taiwan. They had many approaches vis-a-vis Taiwan towards the end of the administration, especially Chinese Communist Party ideological confrontation was something they brought into U.S.-China relationship. So the same value is shared, democracy must be supported. That is the kind of elements that Trump administration showed vis-a-vis Taiwan. This posture of Trump administration was something very much welcomed in Taiwan, of course. Within the Trump administration, for Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan is the most sensitive issue. So it's almost like an Ashley. So, this is something that U.S. can use as a leverage. There is a possibility that there were some people thinking that way within the Trump administration. Viewed from China, of course, that is a very dangerous thing, flirting with fire. So that is the expression they used. So China was watching very closely the relationship between Taiwan and the U.S. Biden administration, the Taiwanese representative in the U.S. Was invited to the inauguration. And then a lot of military aircraft of People's Liberation Army went into the air defense identification zone. So viewed from China, as I said, the stability of the relationship with U.S. is very important, especially next year, come 2022, the 20th Party Congress is going to be held. And at present, how is the situation now? The COVID-19 has hit China, but China is recovering from the damage. Having said so, the long-term deceleration of Chinese economic development continues. So this is the domestic situation that we have to consider. Then, on one hand, the Chinese government will have to show bullish post people, especially on the question of Taiwan. China will stand resolute vis-a-vis U.S. They have to show that to the people. And at the same time, they have to avoid the clash against the United States. They have to come up with such a message. Several days ago, Beijing Daily showed one interesting article. What did it say? the Chinese continent, Beijing government, that is, on the question of Taiwan, will leave Taiwan question for the time being. And in the coming 5 to 8 years, the strategic opportunity for development would be clearly identified and it will be grasped. So for the development of 5 to 8 years, they will look at the opportunity and they will get hold of that. So Taiwan can just Taiwan question can be left as it is for the time being. That is the gist of the article. But nationalism is rising in China because it is instigated, it is flamed by the government. But nowadays, the message, can it be accepted straightforwardly for the people? The PLA may have some adventurists. Of course, as Mr. Kanehara emphasized, for the deterrence, posture will have to be shown. U.S. has to show very clearly the posture for restraint and deterrence. On the other hand, Biden administration will concretize its Taiwan policy. Going forward, the sensitivity of Taiwan question for China should be fully understood. That understanding is very essential in coming up with any policy. That is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On Taiwan question, that is closely related to what happened in Hong Kong. And because of that, in the United States, they have the atmosphere trying to think about the situation very seriously. Taiwan may come next to Hong Kong. In Japan, we are not that sensitive, it seems. But as I listened to what Takahara-san had said, experts in Japan do have more in-depth knowledge and understanding vis-a-vis Taiwan, the question that I believe has been indicated to the audience. So Jim, can I turn over to you?
Sure, thank you. That was very interesting. Patty, I'll come to you kind of for the last question, formal question. We have a lot of questions coming in through the chat function, so we'll get to those immediately afterwards. But now getting away from the geographical kind of national issues, but it's been touched on before, these issues of human rights, democracy, the climate change, environmental issues. How easy or difficult do you think it will be to develop common approaches between the United States and Japan and allied coordination in East Asia on these issues vis-a-vis China's position when they come into conflict with China's position?
Thanks, Jim. So to just back up a little bit and start where Amy ended, I think, again, in the Biden administration, there will be a lot of interest in advancing many of the alliance mechanisms and coordination efforts that came into play in recent years. For instance, like boosting cooperation among the Quad and bringing in other US allies and partners, whether into that framework or different ones, to advance military cooperation, to collectively diversify supply chains and reduce reliance on China in certain sensitive areas like 5G, to provide oversight and alternatives to Chinese infrastructure projects in the Indo-Pacific region. I think these types of things will likely to continue to be on Washington's agenda. I think we are also likely to see efforts to rally US allies and partners to collectively call out China on human rights abuses and its aggressive actions in the East and South China Sea, vis-a-vis Taiwan and Hong Kong and so on. And finally, I think there will be efforts to create coalitions of like-minded partners to shape rules and norms in international institutions in the tech and digital sectors and in other critical realms. And of course, to get back to your question, Jim, while coordination and coalition building are certainly ideal, I don't think these kinds of efforts will always come easily, given the diversity of interests and priorities, even among Washington and its closest allies. And while it's safe to say that I think, probably all US allies and partners have been alarmed by Beijing's confrontational wolf warrior type diplomacy and elements of China's behavior, especially in their immediate neighborhoods. At the same time, as it's been pointed out by other speakers, most of these allies also count on China as their largest trade partner and certainly don't believe that it's realistic to fully decouple with or to completely alienate Beijing. And so my hunch is that cooperation on certain hard security issues, such as collectively countering Chinese military aggression in the East China Sea, or maybe even like tackling the Taiwan issue, might be easier to achieve than coordinating on values-based concerns or taking action in regions that are further away, where China might be acting in ways that are destabilizing, because these kinds of issues may be seen by allied and partner countries and their publics as less relevant for their direct national security and economic interests. And so I think Washington may see some reluctance by allies and partner countries to expend their diplomatic capital on softer issues or in places further afield, because they don't want to risk diplomatic backlash or even economic retaliation from China. But to be able to send a compelling message to China and to shape its behavior on tough issues, I think it's important to be able to rally a critical mass of states and not just the usual few partners, which again will not always be an easy thing to do. And so I think the challenge for the Biden administration will be prioritizing issue areas where coordination is necessary, convincing US allies and partners that working together to promote democratic norms and to push back on China's authoritarian behavior are indeed about vital common interests and not simply about scoring points in the US-China battle for prestige, and certainly not about starting a new Cold War. So I think these are some things that the new administration will need to think about. And I'll conclude by pointing out that I think to achieve this kind of coordination, Washington will also need to seriously consider how it can offer comprehensive support and reassurance to allies and partners who will face economic, diplomatic, and military pressure from Beijing for strengthening their strategic cooperation with the United States. So let me leave it there, Jim, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great. No, thank you. That was actually something talked about kind of at the end of the Trump administration by some, this idea of an economic Article 5, banding together to defend countries from economic coercion from China. So, that may be an issue that is discussed to some extent. So, Professor Kamiya, I have lots of questions in English. You have lots of questions in Japanese. Do you mind if I just take one right now in English and then give you a chance to pick a question from the Japan side?
Yes, indeed, please. But before that, there is one thing which was not discussed today, and I'd like to raise them. I'd like to ask the two U.S. panelists. So may I speak about those 2 points which were not mentioned? All right.
Sure.
That is to say this. The foreign policy is domestic policy. That is strongly mentioned by Biden administration. And at the same time, the diplomatic base of Biden administration is that foreign policy is for the middle class. Repeatedly, they said so. Jake Sullivan, in many places, emphasized this. Does this impact and influence U.S. posture on China? Patty and Amy, just one word, very briefly, can you respond to my question?
Well, while they think about that, just very briefly, I'll say this. I think this will be a question that U.S. policymakers, especially in the White House and over in policy planning at state, a lot of this work stems from work that was carried out actually at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a multi-year project looking at foreign policy connection to economic and social well-being of American states and cities and counties. And it connects in a number of different ways. Trade policy is certainly one. Attracting investment, addressing economic inequalities in economic negotiations, so not just reducing tariffs, but also negotiating the reduction of tax havens and the ability of companies to offshore and to go to other countries. So those issues will be there. Military deployments, the cost of the military. So we may see an impact on the U.S. defense budget in this regard. But on specific China policies, I'm not aware of how it's going to play. I don't think it's clear yet how it's going to play, and maybe our other American panelists have an opinion.
Well, I'll jump in. I think there are a lot of dynamics at play that make this question very confusing, because I mean, Jim, you just gave an interest group answer. It's classic. I'm a political scientist, so I love these pluralist kind of interest group answers to how we should think about our trade or economic or foreign policy. It should be that it should reflect sort of in the aggregate how it affects farmers and cities and urban areas and whatever. But in fact, it right now in the United States, and historically I should say, that often has been the case for American trade policy. There's a lot of good work on that, the way American trade policy evolved over time in ways that reflected changes in American industrial patterns and demographics, et cetera. But right now, our politics are very strange, because when you look at public opinion polls, there's actually still broad support for free trade, for Trans-Pacific Partnership, for globalization. The majority of Americans still say that globalization is good for me and good for America, for example. This is shown in the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations polls and Pew polls and other things. But in some predictable ways. So younger people tend to show higher support, and people from coastal, West Coast and East Coast that does more trade show higher support, and urban areas show higher support. But what the strange thing is that it doesn't break down along party lines like you might think, because Democrats have been not pro-free trade because of their ties to trade unions, which have now become very anti-free trade. So even though the Democratic base is very pro-free trade in terms of public opinion polling, the Democrats have not been a pro-free trade party. And the Republicans, which have been a pro-free trade party, have swung very much against free trade because of Trump, and because they have become this very sort of grievance, America first, close the borders kind of anti-globalization party. So it's the trade politics are sort of upside down, and they don't reflect necessarily the underlying interests. So I think there has to be a lot that has to be done at home to sort of like sort this out. And it's a bit of education. There's a lot of public messaging that has to be done. So yes, foreign policy is typically done by diplomats towards foreign audiences. And it's long been a problem that it has not been well communicated to the American public. And the American public is often very misinformed. The classic example is foreign aid, which most Americans think that like half of the American foreign policy budget goes towards foreign aid, when in fact it's about, 1 or 3% or some very, very tiny amount. And so, politicians are always out there saying, well, we should cut foreign aid because it's too much money for taxpayers. But it's a tiny, tiny amount. So there's a lot of work has to be done to educate voters about the benefits and the relatively low costs of a lot of these policies.
Thanks. That's something we're going to have to keep an eye on and see how it unfolds. One question I have here from Mia Tanaka of Kyoto News wanted to ask specifically about the Quad and the role that the Quad should play in the years ahead in China policy. What's its potential realistically going forward? This is not directed to anyone specifically. Kanehara-san, I don't know if you have a thought about it, or Amy or Takahata-sensei.
May I venture into this question? Well, take China, 3 times more and US is 4 times, and China will catch up with US shortly. So military expenses 20 trillion yen, and the Japanese one is 5 trillion yen. So, but the Chinese military budget is larger than European countries plus Japan. And Japan is alone. We don't have nuclear weapons. There is no France, no UK to stand by our side. So what we can depend is only Australia. Korean administration, it's a left-wing government, and their policy vis-a-vis China is confused. We really want Korea to come for our side. And population-wide, the Chinese population is going, the Indian population is going to grow, and young population is going to grow. So we have to talk with many countries, UK, Germany, France, and we will have to talk with these countries. The ASEAN countries, they are scared of China, so they don't want to respond to our posture. So we started with the Quad. When it comes to military alliance, it is U.S., Japan, India, and Australia. India is a non-aligned country, so it's not that the alliance relationship, but the Quad is the only way that we can have. Jim, all right?
Sure. I don't know if Amy has a quick point.
Can I just say a quick point on the Quad? I am a big proponent of the Quad. I think it's wonderful that Malabar now includes both Japan and Australia. I think it sends a very strong message that our militaries, our navies can cooperate together. And there's huge potential for the Quad to expand into other areas. However, I do get concerned when there is too much emphasis on the Quad for 2 reasons. First, I think the Quad is, although there's huge potential, I think it is going to evolve very slowly. And I worry that there's going to be too much expectations put on the Quad that will disappoint, because India is always going to want to move at a very slow pace that's going to be comfortable for India. So don't raise too much expectations on the Quad, that will sink it. And number 2, if expectations are raised too high and there's too much talk about the Quad, that makes ASEAN countries very uncomfortable. They think that they are being pushed aside. So people that don't understand the dynamics within the Quad, I think, get too booster-ish. They get too excited about the Quad and want to run with the Quad and forget about the others in the region. And so we have to temper our expectations and enthusiasm.
Thank you. Kamiya-sensei?
Yes, thank you. Now, question written in Japanese. There are many questions, so with my prerogative, I will just select one. There is Nozomu Takaoka, that's the name of the questioner. In a nutshell, democratic countries must coordinate, and can we stand up against China? That's going to be a very salient point, not only US and Japan alone. So in doing so, the important thing is the trends in Europe. Looking at Europe, especially Germany is a case in point. Economic interest is regarded more important, and from that perspective, they have appeasing attitude to China. There are many European countries taking that kind of attitude, appeasing attitude. So in Japan, come Biden administration, I don't know how to describe it. Rather, we are tending to look at Europe, not limited to China issue. U.S. diplomacy is coming close to a European line. That may be a concern for us. Now, vis-a-vis that kind of tendency, what should Japan do? This does not specify to whom, what Japan should do. So Takahara-sensei, do you have any idea what Japan should do? I think that's the question. Yes? Every country finds it very difficult to approach China. I know I'm repeating myself. you have to go into a very fierce competition if you approach China. But is it okay that we don't cooperate with China? Of course, we should cooperate, and we must solidly grasp the benefit from the competition. So we have to do both. But we are not accustomed to doing so. So Japan and China, between these two countries, cooperation is standing out in the global context. How come Japan is so close to China, having good terms with China? Many people ask from US and Europe. So the point is that we should have good communication. What is the position that we are standing in? What is the idea? What is the principle that we have? What is the philosophy with which we are liaising with China, cooperating or competing against China? So the communication is the core important element in this regard. You have to do this, otherwise the sense of distrust is coming, as a questioner hinted in his question.
Thank you very much. The point raised just now is also closely related to the overall topic, how to bring in the coordination for policy of Japan and the United States. So, Mr. Schoff, the next question, please.
Sure. I have a question from Mark Mannion, the Congressional Research Service, about the military coup in Myanmar. And I'm going to paraphrase his question a little bit and turn it into this risk opportunity dimension with China. Is China does China add risk to U.S. Japan policy coordination vis-a-vis Myanmar, or does it offer some opportunity in terms of addressing this situation? Presumably, if Biden wants to go down a route of reimposing sanctions and trying to pressure the military regime, Japan may want to respond differently, but China, I'm not clear yet on what China's position is on this coup. It doesn't maybe care that much about the democracy movement, but it certainly doesn't want destabilization and a weak Myanmar on its border. Any thoughts from the panel on Myanmar and China as a risk or opportunity in addressing coordinating U.S.-Japan policy there?
Well, I'll step in if it's okay, Jim. First of all, I think we should be careful when we think about countries like Myanmar, especially Myanmar, to think that Myanmar's internal decisions will be determined by external actors, whether it's China, United States, or Japan. Myanmar, including the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military, has no natural love for China. So they're not natural allies for China, but of course, China is not going to be particularly critical of a military coup. So that does complicate our efforts to try to isolate or sanction Myanmar for this coup, which is a factor for democratic backsliding across the region. And it does sort of push us closer together with Japan in the sense of, it does make it it does make it easier for us to coordinate with Japan when we realize that that China is in the background as a friendly ally for democratic backsliding across the region. So it behooves us to kind of work more closely together. But at the same time, there's no easy solution here. And so there's no just simple coordination and hard line sanctions is not going to get some kind of easy result either, because Myanmar is perfectly used to being isolated and sanctioned and is not likely to change their internal calculus, at least not in the short term. So I hope that that we have, sanctions should certainly be on the table, but I don't know if that should be the absolutely first resort to put all the sanctions back on. I think we need to engage and not, in other words, my point is, I hope we don't go back to only thinking about Myanmar through a lens of China. This is not just about, we got to, get Myanmar away from China. This is also about Myanmar and getting Myanmar away from autocracy and isolation. And we have to approach Myanmar on its own terms, which is a very complicated, difficult space. And so we do have to kind of figure out a way to engage and figure out the best way, the best tools we have to try to get them out of this very difficult situation.
Very interesting. Any other thoughts, or do you want to do another question, Kamiya-sensei?
Anybody having additional answer? Myanmar is such a topical new development. So if any panelists have any opinions, I'd like to hear them. I think for the benefit of the audience, it will be very interesting to hear comments from the panelists. May I? All right. Myanmar people are Mongolians and like Tibetans, and they have Mongolian patch in their back. So temperament is very close to Japanese. Military is strong. After democratization, management of the government was done with military relations, but they were not having a smooth management. They had many strifes. If we go very strong, then the Aung San Suu Kyi's party will be reinvigorated. It's a swaying between left and right and so forth. So, formalistically, of course, they follow the constitution, but it's a coup d'etat, so it is not something that we can really accept. But what about China? China will move from our grouping. They have minorities, and if weapons are given to minorities, Myanmar will be in a very dire situation. They don't like that. We have to stand on human rights and democracy. Something. Do we just add sanction? I think we should think twice. All countries human rights, economic and strategic issues. Sometimes we cannot accept, but if we have a stern sanction, things will resolve. No, Myanmar will only go to Chinese side. And China is waiting for that.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time. So perhaps one last question. Perhaps we can entertain one last question or one last question each. So Jim, you can pick up one question in English, and then I will also pick up one last question in Japanese. So would that work, do you think? Would it be okay?
Sure. Do you want to go? Sorry. Do you want to go first with the Japanese question, or shall I go?
No, Jim, you go first.
Okay. I'm just looking through. I'm trying to get as broad of a question as possible. Well, one of the questions came in from Kevin Mayer, was directed at Kanehara-san, but I'd be curious too if Patty or others have thoughts about it. But in the defense area, vis-a-vis China, what do you see as the most immediate area of improvement needed in the U.S. Japan alliance in order to respond to Chinese growing military power and capability?
Well, the military power of China has become too huge. So we need to think about how to overcome our weaknesses. If not, we will lose out. The United States is 10,000 kilometers, 100,000 kilometers away. So Japan may be hit first by China before the United States. So we need to use the cutting edge technology to try to read what the China may do. We need to have a good deterrence, solid deterrence. We need to have science and technology and research and development into new weapons and how to operate those new weapons. As I have mentioned earlier about Taiwan, as Takahara Sensei has said, on the surface, ambiguous policy is fine. Not to try to crash on the China. But physically speaking, the China has a very strong attack capability. If they try to take over Taiwan, they can do it anytime. In Europe, the Russia that has being very close to China with the nuclear deterrence. I don't think there is any country, even the United States, be able to win over China in conventional arms. So we need to stabilize strategically a relationship with China, including militarily. We need to work out between Japan and the United States. So, Kenny, what would you think, please?
So I guess should I take a stab at this question as well? I could be
Sure.
very brief. So in terms of, priority areas that the US and Japan will want to think about in the security realm, I think Taiwan is certainly high up on the list. Also potential flashpoints in the South China Sea, East China Sea. I mean, these have always been high up on the list, but are increasingly so. Also, I think another area where the US and Japan, and as well as other US allies and partners, will need coordination is on non-proliferation and arms control. There's a lot of interest here in the United States in looping in China in arms control as it modifies and expands its nuclear arsenal. And before we do that, before the US and China get bilaterally engaged on these issues, there needs to be a lot of coordination between the United States and Japan and its other allies on what this means for extended deterrence concerns for our allies. And so I think these are some priority areas where the Biden administration may be looking next in terms of security coordination.
Thanks. That's a good point. Kamiya Sensei, the final question for you.
Yes. Just like Jim has done, I was trying to search for a broad-based question. A student from the doctorate course from Mr. Osaki from Australian National University, there's a question I myself wanted to ask. The theme of symposium is managing China, adapting U.S. Japan coordination amid political transition, as Patty has also referred to. We need to think about the perception gap between Japan and US, and also there are also agreements and consensus as well. The important gap, what may be the most important gap, and what may be the important agreements or the consensus? I would like to ask the panelists from the US side as well as Japanese side to respond. So Takahara Sensei, would you like to go first from the Japanese side? To be very frank with you, the Biden administration team, what would they think and what kind of policy they would come forward with? We need to wait and see. Until we do that, I don't think we will be able to identify any gap between the two governments. But having said so, in Tokyo, as well as in Washington, and also in Beijing, competition and cooperation, two-pronged approach, what we call, will be the only option for three governments. Need to go through on a trial and error basis, and what will happen from now onwards. And as we go through, the competition will become fiercer and harsher. To reconcile with cooperation, it would be increasingly difficult. But even though it may be difficult, we need to actually continue to do so. So to what extent the people who will be persuaded and convinced to try to maintain peace. So that would be the important point. For the three countries, this will be the common challenge for all of us.
From US side, Patty, Amy, which one should respond to this big question? Jim, which one will respond from US side?
I can let them choose if they like. Go ahead, Patty.
Well, I would say, I think Takahara Sensei.
Or both of them can speak just briefly, and maybe Kanehara Sensei can also respond, and we can wrap it up.
Okay.
So very briefly, I think as Takahara Sensei mentioned, we'll have to wait and see to see, what kind of gaps arise between the United States and Japan with regards to China policy as the Biden administration starts to develop out its China strategy. But I suspect that there might not be too many gaps, and that the United States and Japan are actually very much on the same frame when it comes to understanding that there needs to be elements of both competition and cooperation with China, and that there's really no other option. I think the bigger gap we need to worry about is perhaps between the US and China, and whether this sort of relationship can be actually maintained, and whether Beijing is willing to sign on to both simultaneously competing and cooperating. Is Beijing willing to carve out different issues, whether it's climate change or non-proliferation on the one side, and cooperate there, and at the same time, understand that there will be competition in other areas, whether it's on Taiwan or other important issues for both countries. And so can China sign on to that kind of framework, or does it have to be one or the other? I think that's sort of a gap that we really need to keep our eye on, and will determine the course of US-China relations for the coming decades.
I don't have any.
Thank you very much.
I don't have.
金原さんはいかがですか?
Oh. Go ahead, Amy. Why don't you just say what you were going to say, and then we'll let Kanehara-san have the last word there.
Sure. Yeah, I just I completely agree with Patty in terms of I don't see any major gaps in our emerging between the United States and Japan in our policies towards China. I do, however, think that I think she raises an important point about this confrontation versus cooperation with China. And I just emphatically say that China has to get used to it. And I think China is going to try to convince us that this is going to be problematic. And this is exactly the game China plays. And there's no evidence to suggest that China can't live with this. So, this is the terms we have to be very clear about, because this is the reality we're going to live in. I mean, China does not want to live in a world. I mean, China has to get used to the fact that we are going to be competing with China on many issues for a long time to come, no matter who's president, for a long time to come in the United States. And China doesn't want to live in a world where we're not cooperating on anything, I don't think. So it's a better deal for China than not cooperating on anything, just like it's a better deal for us. So, get over it would be my, response to China. Like, this is the framework we're going to work on. And we can't let China's false choice games get in the way of the kind of frameworks we have to create. And we have to be very clear-eyed and clear-headed about articulating that to China, along with our allies and partners.
Thank you.
All right, last word. Lastly, Kanehara Sensei, please. Between Japan and the US, I don't think there are many gaps for the last 10 years. For the honor of President Obama, first administration Secretary of State was Clinton, and Kurt Campbell was in the State Department. And Kurt Campbell, as far as I know, I think he's the only person who was so serious about Southeast Asia. In the second administration, Clinton team left, and they inclined too much to the climate change. I was surprised. So, but on the second administration, Japanese side was really wobbling. So, by and large, we didn't have many gaps between the two countries. China was still small. 10 years ago, China was small. We were just screaming, but the U.S. was reticent. But in 10 years' time, China will catch up with the U.S. So I think we are aligned in terms of how we see China. So big gap between the two countries is the low level of defense capability on Japan, on the Japanese side. Otherwise, we are aligned. Well, thank you very much. We can go on and on, but we have gone overboard with time for 10 years. So 2 moderators, we will have the concluding remarks, and we will conclude. First, Shof Sensei, please have your words.
Well, I just want to thank all the panelists for their contributions and working with Kokusai Forum and our team at Carnegie. Thanks to everyone watching today. This will continue to go on. Our project will continue into next year, we'll have more papers produced, and we'll be diving into these individual policy areas, looking at U.S.-Japan policy coordination at both the risk and the opportunity. So look forward to more work and discussion to come. Thank you, Kamiya-sensei.
Well, Shof Sensei said it all. There is nothing that I can add. Just one word of addition. Today's event, which was enabled by two interpreters. I'd like to thank two interpreters who enabled this event. Another thing, thank you. As a project leader, as I look back at this project, lastly, 4 panelists have spoken that we don't have so many gaps between Japan and US vis-a-vis China policy. But there are subtle gaps. There are subtle differences. Many people might have felt that. So as far as we are concerned, going forward, new administrations were formed in both countries and diplomatic activities will commence eventually. At a stage like that, we should nip the bud for possible gaps, and we will grow the consensus areas between the two countries. For that, what do we need? From research side, we would like to recommend what we need. That's what I want to do. We want to do. In any event, China is a complex entity, complex partner. At times, we think that China is all, but on the hand, after all, China is the second strongest country in the world, and it is not productive to say at all with her. So how do we how do we come to terms between these two different views, India, Pacific Oceans, Southeast Asian countries, and European countries, which have a good communication? The research project going forward will organize an event like this. So on these points, this can be a forum of exchange of views, and happy can be Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for today.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a good evening, Kamiya-sensei.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.